So welcome to Labor Day. For those of you who are new here this morning and we're sort of thinking you'd be out in 45 minutes, you're at the wrong place, because this is about the time we often start the sermon, and we don't even start for quite a while yet. But I'll try to make this as painless as possible. So why are we talking about Labor Day here in church? Because it's not a holiday that is sort of terribly biblical in a sort of a straightforward kind of way, but then of course neither is Christmas. This right, so Labor Day is coming up tomorrow, and there's going to be lots of speeches given by various politicians and stuff like that, and they're going to talk about the value of labor and things like that. And unfortunately, quite often they're also not going to mention things like living wage or healthcare or things like that. But the other thing that they're not going to mention is any connection to faith. And so my job this morning is to try to make that connection a little more obvious, to say that Labor Day is very much, or should be very much, a Christian holiday, as well as a holiday for everybody else, obviously. I realize it's also potentially, I don't know how to say this, it potentially could sound a bit self-serving. Because this is a day for the laboring classes. And I'm not sure how many of you fit that category. I mean, the laboring, exactly where that line is a bit tricky. I often think about the laboring classes as people who have jobs that don't require a degree. And that's not very many of us here, right? I mean, is there, like me, when I do my handyman work, I'm part of the laboring classes. I'm guessing the nurses going to suggest that they're part of the labor, because it's hard work, even though they have to have a degree to get the job. And I think also a lot of you have entered part of the laboring classes that's often been forgotten, and that is the stay-at-home parents, which I can assure you from much experience is also a lot of work, doesn't pay very well, and doesn't require a degree. So anyway, you decide if you're part of the laboring classes or not. But in any case, that's what we're talking about here today, is people who work with their hands, like Paul said. So how do we bring our faith into this? Well, the Bible starts, right, with the creation story and Adam and Eve, and then God creates this garden. And sometimes we may have this impression that God creates the garden, and then the people just sort of sit around and eat the stuff that falls from the trees, because the garden was created for them. But if you actually read the story, it says that God put the people, Adam and Eve, into the garden to cultivate and keep it. And so it's really more like the people were created for the garden than the garden was created for the people, right? That labor, hard physical labor, was very much part of what the human beings were created to do. That's part of the big plan. Right? Physical work is not something that just sort of happened later or a result of sin. It was part of God's plan. And so this plan gets fleshed out more in the book of Deuteronomy. And so we read a piece of that, right? And it's all about creating a society that's pleasing to God. And the Bible basically assumes that agriculture is the basis of everything. And of course, we all got to eat, so that's not very surprising. Right? And so in an agricultural society, what's really one of the really important themes in Deuteronomy is the creation of a system for overcoming equality, right? That this is at the very root of faith, is that when there's income equality, there has to be some way to overcome this, right? Just as a side note, right? You may have heard regularly in our society that the basic thing about Christianity is having a personal relationship to Jesus, which is oddly enough a phrase that's not found anywhere in the Bible, but the Bible talks much more often about creating systems for overcoming equality and for creating societies that are pleasing to God. So anyway, this system that the Bible creates recognizes that equality will happen. It's just going to happen. And therefore, it needs to be overcome. It's not something that will happen and therefore live with it. It's like it will happen and therefore fix it. Right? And you may have recognized a phrase in Deuteronomy that Jesus quotes later, the poor you will always have with you. And again, it's one of those phrases that people sometimes use today, the poor you will always have with you, as a way of saying, well, there's nothing you can do about it, right? Because the poor you will always have with you. But Deuteronomy says the poor you will always have with you, which is, first of all, a sign that the system is broken. And second of all, means you should be generous, right? The poor you will always have with you, therefore fix it. Deuteronomy also recognizes that a lot of poverty is related to debt, right? And I'm guessing there's a few people listening this morning who are going, yep, know that one, right? Deuteronomy doesn't talk a lot about student debt. It's not a big theme in the Bible, but it certainly is a big theme in society today. And right among us, I'm guessing most of us, all of us here, have seen a little bit of student debt, and some of you maybe seeing student debt the rest of your lives. So, right, debt is a major problem. The book of Deuteronomy starts by assuming that everybody starts out with land, right? It's sort of the 40 acres and a mule idea, except that in Deuteronomy, everybody starts out with 40 acres and a mule, and nobody starts out with more than that. That's what you get. Everybody gets the same amount. And the idea is that the basics of life, therefore, are taken care of for everybody, except, right? Except for drought and plague and war and ineptitude and disease and accidents, and right, so the list kind of goes on and on. So Deuteronomy says stuff happens, therefore debt, right? So at some point, you just can't harvest enough off your land, or you might lose your land, right? And so debt happens. So the idea in Deuteronomy is to fix the problem while it's still small. So every 7 years, all the debts get canceled nationally, right? So that the debts don't increase generation to generation, and also wealth doesn't increase generation to generation, because those who have lots, they lend to it and then it's gone, right? So it's very much a system. On the other hand, by the time we get to Jesus' day, and we start, so our passage today was from Matthew, and if you remember from the various stories, parables that Jesus tells lots of stories about servitude, about slavery, and about laborers, right? And he assumes, so he is living in a society where there's really big landowners who've got lots and lots of land, and they of course don't do anything, the landowners, that they've got servants and slaves. Plus seems to be a lot of use of day laborers. Jesus tells stories about people just standing around waiting to get these day labor positions. Right, so clearly in Jesus' day, this whole Old Testament system has broken down, which isn't surprising because the people of Israel are not in charge of their own land. The Romans are, before that the Greeks were, and before that the Persians were. So it's been a long time since they've been in charge of their own land. And the Romans, one of the ways they reward people who work with them is by giving them estates, right? So you got the Roman rulers, and you work carefully with them, and after a while, they go, hey, we'll give you some land, which basically means the soldiers go in and turf the farmers off their land and give it to you, and then you hire those people back to work on this land, and you take most of the profit. Right, so the whole Old Testament system has broken down, and people find themselves working very, very hard and not getting anything out of it because they're working for somebody else. And Jesus comes and offers rest. Sometimes in church we forget that. We forget that Jesus has come to offer us rest, because sometimes in church we think, right, come to me who are labor and heavy burden, and I'll put you on a committee. That's probably the more typical kind of response in the church. And rest is, way down the list somewhere. But rest is actually, right, one of the major tasks we have as Christians is to rest. And the next story, if we kept on going in Matthew, the next story is of Jesus and his disciples walking through the field and just sort of picking up, right, the corn that they're walking past and eating it. And they get into trouble for this, but not because they're picking the corn and eating it. somebody else's corn, but because it happens to be the Sabbath, that apparently perfectly okay just to walk into a field, help yourself, part of the system. Wow. So finally, we get to 1 Thessalonians 4. And I realize that this is also one of these passages that has been used to shame the poor, right? Well, you got to get a job, you got to work with your hand, right? And so if you're unemployed, man, it just means that you're lazy. The Bible says you got to get a job. But that's probably, again, not what this passage was meant to do. That in Paul's day, the people who weren't working with their hands and who were dependent were, in fact, the wealthy. Right? So what Paul is trying to do here is raise manual labor. In the Greek society, the ideal for a man, and possibly even a woman, is to get to a place where you don't have to work anymore, that you've got other folks to work for you, right? But Paul says, no, working with your hands is a good thing. And he sets this example, that he's very proud of the fact that when he goes and plants a new church, he doesn't immediately say, well, I got a new church planted, great, they can start paying my salary here and I'm fine. He keeps on working with his hands, the tent maker, because he doesn't want to be dependent on anybody, and he encourages others not to be dependent. And we need to understand that it's the rich who live dependent lives, right? That so many of us, especially pre-COVID, were running around working so hard that we didn't have time to grow our own food. We didn't have time to cook our own food. And so we were dependent on food coming from far away and all that labor that it took. And then somebody else cooked it for us. And we just like sort of showed up at the store or showed up at the restaurant. Somebody did all the actual work. Right? So it's actually all of our work time that makes us dependent, oddly enough. Where this gets all tricky is when we throw Jesus back into the mix, however, because Jesus in his whole ministry was dependent. He didn't work in any sort of with your hands sort of sense. He was a carpenter at some point, but we sort of generally assume that when he became a rabbi, he stopped being a carpenter. And so Jesus is not a good example if you have to, we shouldn't be dependent on each other, because right, that was Jesus' whole ministry. And of course, I'm also not a good example here because I'm dependent on you, right? That if you all decided to stop paying me, then I would just stop being paid, right? So again, I'm not the great example here of how not to be dependent. Anyway, right? So in all of this, what I'm simply trying to show you is that Labor Day is very much connected to our faith. And the dignity of manual labor, of actually working with your hands and working with your muscles, is embedded in the Bible. It's very much part of our faith, part of what we bring when we confess Jesus as Lord. It's also worth remembering that manual labor is just hard work. Right? And however much we dignify it and praise it, and like especially now with these are essential workers, right? That if you're a farmer in the old days before you sat on your tractor and had the GPS and the computer do all your work for you, right? But in the old days, if you got to 40 or 50 in decent health, that was almost a miracle. I remember talking to Harold Martin one time. Harold and his wife Algreta are part of our church, and they're Tom's parents and Will's parents. And I was talking to Harold, and his dad was a farmer in West Virginia. And so I said, well, Harold, why didn't you become a farmer? And he goes, that was just too much work, right? That farming in West Virginia would have been, still is, hard work, because this is not good land. This is not easy place to be a farmer. And so while Harold went on to be a laborer, he worked for WVU in a machine shop. And so while he was still working with his hands, at least there was a salary at the end of this rather than farming, in which case there was just like more work really at the end of it. And his children and grandchildren have gone on to be, right, sort of progressively less, because manual labor is hard work. So insofar as we want to raise the dignity of manual labor, right, we also need to understand that work is just work. I often used to tell my kids that the reason you get summer jobs that are just hard work is to remind yourself of why it is you don't want to do manual labor for the rest of your life. So that is my sermon this morning. And we're going to go now into a breakout room, if I can manage this again. And I want you to talk about your relationship to manual work right now. How you're feeling about being dependent, how you feel, has COVID changed how much work you're doing in garden or in cooking, or in raising your children or in raising your parents, or however you see that. So talk about Labor Day and your relationship to work.